Hi everybody, this is Diane and I am ready to show you these two sewing book binders. Yay! I had a lot of fun making them. I love the sewing theme. I have a lot of sewing ephemera and supplies that I could incorporate into these books, and it was fun doing the binder thing, so I just had a lot of fun. I'm going to start with this one since that was the first one that I made. This is a Better Homes and Garden sewing book, as you can see, with the beautiful white cover with the photos of the sewing supplies and tools on there, and it is in good shape. There's a little bit of discoloration, dirt, what have you, but it's in good shape. And I left the front plain. I might put a little label on here somewhere so that you can write your name on it. Other than that, I'm not going to touch it. Look at that 1970s sewing room. It's a cool sewing room. I wouldn't want it to be those colors, but I do like it. So I decorated some of the tabbed dividers, as you saw if you saw some of the videos that I made on the process. So this is a very vintage pattern envelope that the woman ordered from a mail order company, and it would come in the mail, and the pattern was a design by Quilted, and this was an image from one of the Quilted patterns. So I just sewed two pieces of cardstock together and used a pinking shear to pink around the edges, and then I just glued that onto the front of it, and you can journal on the back. I repaired any tears or weak spots with washi tape. Now this is a design team project for the old design shop, and I used two of her kits. One was the sewing flashcards, and one was I forgot what they're called, but they're pages. It's just a page like that you would fold and put into your journal. And you can get them, they print white, and you can also print them so that they look like they're on coffee dyed paper. Those are really cool. So to do something different, and another thing I wanted to do and I didn't was to just cut these out and use them as embellishments, but I didn't do that. But another thing I did to it was print it on patterned paper, so you'll see some of that throughout these books. I also printed the flashcards on two different patterned papers. This is a blue, doesn't really have a pattern on it, it's just got a little bit of mottled design on it. So that's one of the sewing cards, and I just glued it there and glued on this piece of vintage trim. And I used all kinds of eclectic papers in here. So this is just a piece of craft cardstock with a pattern on it. I stamped a dress form on this and put it on as a tuck spot, and I cut one of the old design shop pages and with these ornate scissors and just folded it up so it could be a journaling spot. There's a Simplicity wrapping paper in here. This is from an old book about fashion, and I just stitched a piece of pink lace on that. On this divider, I stitched some fabric, and I glued on a piece of vintage pattern instruction, and there's a piece of lace. This is one of the old design shop pages that I printed on yellow polka dot paper. So it's very vintage designs, but the polka dots give it a more modern look, gives it a touch of whimsy. This is another of her pages that I printed on patterned paper, and I folded it in half and punched the holes. This is the page with the ornate scissors. And this page, this half of the page just said dressmaker, so I had all this opportunity to collage on it. So this is a pattern envelope, a vintage pattern envelope that I cut up. And I used the pieces on here, and then just did a little collage with fabric, lace, and button. This is a sheet of, I forgot what it's called, but it's by Fons and Porter. And it's not just paper, it's a little stiffer than that. You were supposed to sew this onto your fabric and then cut around it. I guess, or iron it onto fabric or something. And that would be your quilt piece. This is a really sturdy piece of wallpaper. It's very flexible. I don't know what it's made out of, but it's really cool wallpaper. Then I took this window envelope, and I believe this is one of the seed packets that came from Target, and I did a collage on the front of it. And I took a piece of ledger paper. It's a scrapbook ledger paper. And this is a page from my 1960s pattern book. So I thought that looked really cool to put her in the window. I think I am going to trim a little bit off, and then I don't think it'll stick in the envelope so much. There's room on the back of the envelope to write. It has some lines. Well, I want to get it in there because I don't want to have to go back and fix everything. And I just put the flap of it around the page. This is just a paper clip that I tied a strip of fabric to. So here's something I did with the Old Design Shop flashcards. This is one that's printed on patterned paper. I used pinking shears around it and sewed it to this little piece of green cardstock and put it on as a tiny pocket. These were printed on cardstock. I inked around them, and I just tucked them in there. And then I had one more that I put a eyelet on it and a bulb pin and a little tag and a little bit of lace. Just flips over. This is vintage iron-on transfer, and there's quite a large sheet. So you can take, it's quite fragile. I don't think I would want to write on it. You can see through it, and I think a pen would poke through it. But I would take these elements, cut those elements apart, and just glue them throughout the book. That's what I would do if it was my book. This is from a 1980s pattern book, and I just took this portion of a page and folded it and glued it into a pocket. I punched the holes on the wrong edge, so I covered those holes up with washi tape, and then I punched the holes on the right side. And then this is also an image from that 80s book, just glued to some scrapbook paper, and I have a tab on it, and it fits right in that pocket. I made some paper clips with, or I embellished some paper clips with the flashcards. So it's backed with craft cardstock. I put some ribbon on the paper clip, and I did a little collage, and then I just clipped this little card for journaling. This is a vintage how to sew book or alterations or something, and I just stitched a little piece of ledger paper there. Vintage wrapping paper. Love this wrapping paper. This is also Old Design Shop, one of her pages, and it has the definition for sew, and I printed this on the pattern paper. This is a fold-a-note, a vintage fold-a-note card that you would write on and then send. Pages from this book, which are adorable. And then I just sewed a strip of fabric there that has some cute little girls on it. This is a quilted tulip that I got at a garage sale last year, and I think it was like a little runner that had 4 or 5 of them stitched together, and I took them apart. I did a little patchwork collage on it and just glued it on as a pocket. And I took one of my giant tags, and I had to trim off the bottom so that I could get it to fit. It becomes very narrow down here, so the tag won't go down all the way. And I glued on some pattern tissue and then some of the images from this sewing book. Put some seam binding in it. Some more pages from this book. Again, it's one of the flashcards. Why can I never remember that word? Flashcards on the pattern paper and a little scrap of fabric. There's a little fabric flip up there. This is a piece of the page from the 60s sewing book, a vintage sewing book. Vintage pattern envelope, and I punched holes in it to bind it in, and then I took one of the cut off pieces of paper and I sewed on one of the patterned flashcards and a little scrap of fabric at the top. And on this I just sewed on a pocket made out of paper and some trim, and I took one of the flashcards and sewed it to a journaling card and added some fabric and crochet trim. And then this is just a vintage needle card, needle book from Esso. It still has needles in it. A music page with some vintage fabric and another of the flashcards and one of my clusters that I stapled together. This is scrapbook paper and a piece of the Simplicity wrapping paper and another piece of the vintage wrapping paper. This is an envelope, and I just sewed some vintage lace to the flap, and I didn't do anything else to decorate it, but I did include some scraps and cut-offs that you can use throughout the book, and I'm hoping that you will glue things to the envelope to decorate it. This just has some bits of fabric sewn on it and a ledger paper for writing. Some of these fabrics are vintage. This is a piece, some quilting pieces that my mother had cut out many years ago, and she started sewing them together. So I have some of the pieces, the hexagon pieces that she had put together like a quilt block, and then I had a lot of these that were just cut into the hexagon shape. These two were sewn together, so I just sewed it on there as a flip and added this little piece of embroidery. Can you see that pink embroidery thread there? This is vintage wrapping paper, but it looks like it's quilted. A vintage index card divider, and I sewed on a vintage rickrack wrapper as a little pocket. Cut these ladies out of the 1960s pattern book and just glued them to some cardstock. There's some vintage eyelet and vintage fabric sewn to the edge of that page. This is a wallpaper piece with a Sunbonnet Sue type of girl on it, which is awfully cute. Some vintage embroidery. Isn't that pretty? I sewed it on as a pocket. And then I had this card that I had made with napkin Mod Podged on it and a little drawing from a book about costume. And here is one of Old Design Shop pages, the sewing pages that I printed onto printed paper, and I sewed it to ledger paper and then glued on one of the flashcards. And this is cut from the front of a pattern envelope, a vintage pattern envelope. This is a vintage library card, the kind that the catalog card, and it was a handwritten one instead of a typed one. I just sewed a fabric ruffle to it. And there's a little scrap of paper here as a tuck spot with some bits of, this is actually a piece of vintage linen that I have, but I printed it. I had made a copy of it and printed it on paper. So that's just a little scrap of that and a scrap of vintage lace or fabric. I had stamped this image on here. It looks like a pattern envelope image, but it didn't stamp very well, and so I stamped it on paper and cut it out with rickrack zigzag scissors and glued it on. This stamp always has an issue right there. I think it's a defective stamp. This is one of my little stapled together clusters, and I just glued it on there for an embellishment. Just some extra printable digital printables that I had. I stuck in there, and I just stapled some fabric sheet, vintage sheet. I can't even talk. Vintage sheet here and vintage wallpaper. Some pages from this binder book and a page from the 60s catalog, and this is a page from the 70s book, the other sewing book. This has some really funky paisley on it, and this is one of the little things that I made with the crimper, and I just glued it there, and it has another of the flashcards there. So I did a lot of different things with the flashcards. I love this little piece of fabric. It looks like needlepoint. I don't have a lot of it, but I just think it is so pretty. And some more fabric and vintage trim. Wallpaper here, and then I had made this little journaling card with another flashcard. There's some sewing pattern and some fabric here, and then the flashcard with a little bit of crochet trim and a vintage button. And all of the paper clips, if they weren't made with the flashcards, they have bits of fabric or ribbon or something tied on them. An index tab with a piece of fabric and trim. This is from a I think it was 60s sewing teacher's bundle of stuff that I had, and this was one of the pages, one of her lessons. It says lesson number 1. So she wrote some stuff here, and then there's a piece of fabric with some sewing on it. It was attached to this page. There's another of the pages that I printed on pattern paper. This tab says evening and dress up fashion, so I cut this out of a 1960s. It was a December book. It was one of the smaller books that you could purchase and take home. And she's wearing a fancy dress-up dress, so I glued her on there and then glued on this fancy trim. A little fabric collage there, and another fabric or a pattern envelope, and just a scrap of paper with some lace and fabric. I think this book is too full. When you start adding stuff, it's going to be full. So you feel free to take out anything that you want to. Once you purchase it, it's your book. Make it yours. This is a piece of wallpaper and one of the envelopes with a long flap, and I glued some fabric and a flashcard and a little floral applique there, a vintage one. I just put the flap over the top. Another fabric cluster, simplicity wrapping paper, scrapbook paper scrap, and I stamped a dress on a hanger there. And then on the back, well, this is the card that prevents these pages from rolling under, so I just sewed a piece of trim on there to pretty it up. On the back, I took a clear photo pocket, stitched some lace to the top, stitched it to this paper, glued the paper to the inside cover, and then made this little journaling card. This is a scrap of this paper, and it's from the 80s pattern book that I have. So this is a really fun journal, and it has so much in it. There's a lot in this. You might just have to make sure this card is up so that the papers are all level in there and not sliding down in there and getting bent. So this is the Better Homes and Gardens. It's going to be BH&G sewing book, sewing binder journal in my shop. And this is the other one. I'm going to make this one the 70s sewing binder journal in my shop. It's called Complete Family Sewing Book, but I'm just going to call it the 70s book because look at that. I love that. So I did show this previously on a different video. I decorated this on a video. So this is a vintage 70s sheet with a very wide pink rickrack and some mint green lace, and just some little scraps of fabric there to cover up where the cover was a little more worn here. I do want you to see on the back that there is some It's either where the yellow has worn away a little bit or dirt, but I think it's where, I'm not sure, but I tried to wash it off and I did as well as I could. So there is that marking on the back, which I don't mind. I think it just shows how vintage it is. I love the picture on the back, so I didn't want to cover it. And I left the end papers on because they were too cool to cover. But down here where I had tried to scrub the dirt off of this yellow edging, I kind of scrubbed away some of this paper. So I put this vintage embroidered trim on it. And I did put a label there. There's some vintage gimp trim there. So the divider tabs are quite different from the divider tabs in the Better Homes and Gardens book. They're very 70s and bright colors and just really, really cute. So I didn't want to cover up the front, so most of the decorations that went on these cards went onto the back side. So here's another one of those Quilted envelopes, the same kind of decorations as the other one, and this was the pattern that I believe was in this envelope. Got a lot of the same things in it. There's a stamp there. See, there's one of those funky images. This is from a vintage pattern instruction page. These pages that came in this book are doubled like this. They are perforated, so you could take them apart, but I left them as they are and just put them in the binder like that. This is one of the Old Design Shop's pages that I printed onto patterned paper. It does have the definition for sew up here. And I cut apart a pattern envelope, very vintage pattern envelope, and glued the images down. This was 25 cents. There's another piece of the envelope back here, a little piece of silk fabric and crochet. And then inside the pocket is a page from a vintage sewing book with a colored index card sewn onto it. This page talks about smocking. And then just one of the Old Design Shop pages that I cut. So you can use that for journaling. And these get tucked in here. So for my projects for this month, for both the Old Design Shop and Artsology, I did binder journals, and I didn't use journal kits. I used ephemera kits and then created things with the ephemera to put into the journal. This is that foundation paper for quilting again, some of that really funky wallpaper, and another one of the Target window cards. I won't mess with it this time. And again, one of the little pockets with the flashcards, with the bulb pin and the tag hanging on it. The transfer sheet that you can cut the images out and use them in your book. And there is the paper clip that I made for this one, and then I just put this journaling card on here. One of the pages from Old Design Shop, it has a vintage sewing basket on it, but it's printed on modern paper. Kind of almost tie-dyed, watercolory, I guess. This is vintage ledger paper there. Throughout this book, there are images of this girl that's made out of a spool with a thimble on her head. Vintage wallpaper. Vintage note card, the fold-a-note things, post-a notes. Here is the strips of fabric that have that little girl on them. And in this book, when I cut my papers, I forgot to cut some that would have little flips on them, so there are no flippy pages in here. This page has the Tulip Pocket. Now these are slightly narrower than the Better Homes and Gardens, so you can see it hangs off just a little bit. And I sewed this on rather than glued it so that there would be more space in there. The glue squishes and takes up some of the space. There's the fabric collage, and then I cut some pieces off from a different Simplicity wrapping paper. This is a piece of sewing pattern tissue glued down to that. And then these are some of the flashcards that I tore. I just tore the words and used them. There's one of the flashcards with a piece of fabric from the 60s book, from a vintage sewing book, and a sewing pattern envelope. I really like this, the images on this. One of the old design shop pages. Look at that outfit. This is from the 60s book. I stitched it to this scrap of paper with some trim and stitched it on as a pocket, and then made this card with one of the flashcards and some bits of trim. This is modern and this is vintage. And I included this vintage Dritz bodkin. It turns bias tubing for fabric loops. So when you have little skinny tubes of fabric that you sewed, you use this to help you turn it inside out, right side out. And this was actually inside one of these binder books, and I didn't even know it was there till I started taking pages out to make these journals. There's a flashcard sewn up there with some vintage fabric and one of my stapled clusters. This is a little image from the Simplicity wrapping paper, and this is vintage wrapping paper. An envelope with a piece of vintage fabric strip sewn to it, and then again bits of cut off paper that you can use to make embellishments for the book. And this page just has some fabric triangles stitched along the edge, some ledger paper, fabric flip here, foundation paper, wallpaper. Again, this one has the vintage, this is Rick Rack wrapper on it, and I cut her from the 80s book and glued her to a scrap of scrapbook paper. There's some vintage fabric stitched down here. Wallpaper. Love this one with the house. This one was just a plain square. It did have the, oh, I forgot what that kind of stitch is called, but that was stitched all around. And then I added this vintage applique to it, just glued it on, and then put in a tag and a flashcard. Just a scrap of paper sewn on as a tuck spot, and this is a tag that I made with the old design shop printables onto printed paper. This is from a vintage pattern instruction, and of course one of the flashcards, and a piece of fabric stitched to a colored index card. This is a spare leftover digital kit page. This is a piece of vintage wallpaper up here that I punched with my, I think it's 2 1/4 or 2.5 inch circle and vintage fabric. Has such cool images. One of the Tim Holtz wallpaper pages that are just this size, you buy a package of them, and one of the clusters that I made with the crimper. This is a piece of vintage flannel, piece of a vintage doily, and one of the old design shop images. This section was about how to sew for men, and I just love that image, and I just stamped some buttons and a thimble on there. wallpaper with another one of the journaling cards that I made. This is another of the teacher's pages with a sample, how to do a collar point. This was a section on sewing for children. A little fabric cluster there, and there's this piece with eyelet and ribbon, sheer ribbon, stuck into this vintage pattern envelope. And here is the envelope with the large flap. This time I did the collaging onto the flap part. There's a little fabric cluster, another of Old Design Shop pages, part of the instruction page. I reinforced it. And then a couple of pieces of scrapbook paper. This book didn't have the cardboard thing, but it needed it, so I actually, let me show you what I made that out of. I had these pieces from a Scattergories game, and the cardboard is so nice and sturdy that I've kept it. So I just cut a piece of that and covered it with fabric, put a little trim on it. And then there's the back. These journals will be listed in my shop by the time you see this video. So there you go. I will have the 70s sewing binder journal and the BH&G sewing binder journal listed in my shop. So thanks for watching. I know it was a long flip through for all of these, but there were a lot of details to see. I really appreciate your support, and please give me a thumbs up on this video. It really helps get me seen by more people. I think YouTube will recommend my videos more as I get more thumbs up. So I'd really appreciate that, and I really appreciate comments. I love to read the comments, so please leave a comment. And I will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.